I don't know why I still set out all the placemats. Maybe it was muscle memory, or maybe I was holding on to some foolish hope that this year would be different, that the laughter might return, that my son might bring something other than silence. I placed the good silverware by each plate, the ones we used to polish together when he was a boy. Back then, he'd grip the cloth too tightly and wrinkle his nose at the smell of the polish, but he did it with me anyway. Now I handle it alone. The polish still smells the same, but everything else has changed. There was a time when the dining room echoed with warmth. Not just voices, but warmth the kind that lives in shared glances and secret smiles and half-burnt dinner rolls. My husband used to carve the roast like it was a ritual, always too much meat, always too many jokes. And my son back then would race to pull the crackers or beg for one more spoon of mashed potatoes before we'd even sat down. That was before ambition took him away, before she took him further. This year, I trimmed the tree by myself. I strung lights that flickered unevenly, reminding me of how time falters when you're alone. I baked the same cookies, cinnamon ginger, the lemon shortbread he used to sneak before dinner. I even made that ridiculous cranberry salad no one likes, but everyone expects. I wrapped a gift for him, something thoughtful, something he mentioned last spring in passing, something a mother remembers. But there was no call that morning, no cheerful Merry Christmas, Ma, just the ticking clock and the slow hush of the house. I lit the candles early, hoping the glow might soften the stillness. I even wore my red cardigan with the stitched holly leaves just in case he noticed, just in case he said I looked festive. The turkey browned in the oven like it always had, and I basted it by instinct. There's a strange ache in cooking for people who no longer see the effort. Every stir, every chop is a memory dressed as a task. I hummed to myself, old carols mostly, and waited. I waited long past the time he said he'd arrive. The doorbell didn't ring until the food was starting to cool, and when it did, my heart beat faster, as if I were still that woman from years ago who believed Christmas could mend anything. But what stepped through the door was not a son coming home. It was a man checking a box. No hug, no smile, just a quick hey, like he'd run into me at the grocery store. And he wasn't alone. She followed close behind, purse in one hand, phone in the other, already glancing around the room like she'd forgotten it from last year. She didn't greet me. She said, "It smells like turkey," as though I'd left something burning. I looked at my son, hoping for a shared laugh, something to pull me back to the past. But he was already taking off his coat and asking, "Is there Wi-Fi here again?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen and pretended to be too busy to feel the ache forming in my chest. The kind of ache that settles into your ribs when someone you love stands in your home like a stranger, like a guest, like you are hosting a party you were never invited to. I poured cider into mugs, 3 of them, though I considered only doing 2. Old habits die hard, and kindness even harder. They sat on the couch while I served them, sat without asking, sat without offering, sat as if this house were a stopover between obligations. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked if I needed help. And I stupidly tried to fill the silence. I asked about work, about their boy, about the weather even. And with every lukewarm answer, I felt the temperature inside me dropping like snow, falling in a warm coat, quiet, but not unnoticed. Dinner was ready. I announced it with a smile that took effort. They shuffled to the table without urgency. She sat first at the head, the seat my husband used to take, the seat I never sat in out of respect, out of memory. My son said nothing. I took my seat at the side and looked at the spread I had prepared, steam rising from every dish like a final offering. I said grace quietly the way my mother taught me. I don't know if they even bowed their heads. I didn't look. I just started to eat, and as the clink of forks replaced the absence of conversation, I knew deep in my bones that something sacred had been lost, not just this year, but gradually. Like an heirloom cracked over time, finally breaking in the light. My son had come to dinner, but he hadn't come home. He used to rush into the house, laughing, snow still tangled in his hair, arms open gifts, nearly tumbling from his hands. I remember how he'd shout, "Merry Christmas, Ma," as if saying it louder made it truer. But this time the door creaked open slowly, and in walked a man with shoulders stiff from disinterest. His coat was expensive now, long black, clearly chosen by someone else, and he wore it like armor. I stepped forward, arms slightly out, unsure, but he only nodded, a nod. After a year, after raising him, a nod, as though I were the doorman. His shoes barely brushed the mat I had laid out, the one that used to read, "Home is where the heart is now so worn it barely whispered." He stepped past me and muttered something about traffic, about parking, about how he couldn't stay long because they had plans later. My heart pulled back like a hand from a flame. Behind him came his wife, hair-perfect lips, tighter than her smile. She carried nothing, not a dessert, not a bottle of wine, not even that hollow performative cheer some people offer when they're in someone else's home. She looked around like she was inspecting a rental property. Her heels clicked on my floors too loud, like the sound was meant to remind me this was no longer her kind of place. And still I smiled. I smiled like I had all the years before, because mothers are taught that grace matters more than grief. I told them to take a seat, offered to take their coats. She didn't look at me when she handed hers over, just tossed it toward the hook. I caught it. Of course I did. And I hung it up, hands, trembling slightly at the shoulders, trying to shake off the dust of shame that had settled over me since they walked in. He sat in the corner of the couch, pulled out his phone and thumbed through something. Messages, probably. Work, maybe. Anything but me. I brought out cider. I brought out the cookies he used to love, and he said thanks, without looking up, as if I were a waitress in a tired diner, and not the woman who rocked him through colic and nightmares and growing pains. I tried asking him about work, a careful, hopeful tone. He answered like I was conducting an interview. "It's busy, that's all. No stories, no sparkle, no trace of the boy who used to rattle on about every tiny triumph." I asked about my grandson. Where was he? She said he didn't want to come. He's not into small houses. That was how she said it. Small houses. Like this place, the home I'd poured every hour into, was somehow beneath him, beneath them. And I smiled. I kept smiling. It's strange how you can feel your heart breaking without making a sound. It doesn't shatter, it frays. Slowly, quietly, in the way your hands shake when you pour cider. In the way your throat tightens as you laugh too quickly at a comment that wasn't even a joke. They didn't notice the garland I had hung around the fireplace, the one made of dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks like we used to do together, when money was tight and magic had to be homemade. They didn't notice the photo I had moved closer to the tree, him at 6, in a snowman sweater holding up a misshapen gingerbread house. I thought it might stir something, but it sat there unseen like me. When I asked if they'd like to open presents before or after dinner, she said, "Oh, we didn't do gifts this year. Hope that's okay." Just like that. A shrug, a dismissive wave. He didn't look up, didn't disagree, just let her speak for him like he always did now, like he couldn't find the space between her words to insert his own. I wanted to tell him I had a gift for him, something small but personal, but suddenly it felt like a burden. like offering a handmade scarf to someone wearing designer wool. I left the gift under the tree, unopened, unnoticed. The rest of the hour dragged like a winter storm outside the window, gray, slow, and heavy with silence. Occasionally she would scroll through her phone and let out a quiet chuckle showing him something. Something funny, apparently. I wouldn't know. They never turned the screen toward me. I might as well have been a piece of furniture in the room, a sentimental fixture. At one point I excused myself to the bathroom just to breathe. I looked at my face in the mirror and whispered, "You're doing fine." I wasn't, but no one had time to notice that either. When I returned, they were talking about flights for New Year's, a trip somewhere sunny. "We just need to escape," she said, sipping cider she hadn't thanked me for. "It's just been such a draining season." I nodded like I understood, even as the chill in my own bones had nothing to do with the snow outside. I sat in the same chair I had rocked him to sleep in 30 years ago. That night I sat straight hands, folded a guest in my own home. And he was just a visitor, just passing through, just a name in my phone that used to mean son. She walked into the dining room like it belonged to her. No pause, no glance for permission, no hesitation. Just a quiet, deliberate path to the chair at the head of the table. My husband's chair, the one no one sat in for the first few years after he passed out of respect, the one I still polish more carefully than the others. It felt like a small betrayal every time someone sat there without asking, but no one ever had. Until her. She didn't even flinch. She placed her phone on the table beside the plate I had set, and with the same motion she began scrolling, as if the holiday was some formality she had to suffer through before she could return to real life. I stood frozen in the doorway, holding the carved turkey on the platter I had saved for special occasions, and for a second I didn't know whether to say something or just swallow the ache. I chose silence. My son followed behind her a few steps behind hands in his pockets. He glanced at the table at her, then at me, but didn't say a word about where she sat, didn't suggest a different chair, didn't even seem to notice. Or maybe he did. Maybe that was the hardest part. He noticed and let it happen anyway. I placed the turkey in the center of the table, pretending my hands weren't trembling. I heard her murmur something under her breath about how tight the space was, and I turned quickly to the kitchen before I could react. There was no point. She saw this house as something cramped and outdated, a holding pen for old women with old memories. I served everything: potatoes, green beans, sweet rolls, the cranberry salad he never liked, but I always made. She didn't help. He didn't either. They just sat. She picked at the edges of the napkin while I moved around the table like a waitress in her own home. Every scrape of the serving spoon against the bowl echoed in my head like a reminder that my role here had been reduced to hostess. When I finally sat, it was in the chair I always used, off to the side, never at the head. I still couldn't bring myself to sit there. Not while I could still hear my husband's laugh echo off those walls. Grace used to be something sacred. He'd bow his head even when he was small, even when he didn't understand why. I spoke it softly, eyes closed, voice thick with old hymns. When I opened my eyes, she was already serving herself. My son was checking his phone again. No amen, no pause. The turkey was tender, perfect, really. But I watched her barely chew as though she were enduring a chore. She asked if I used butter or oil in the green beans. I smiled and said, "Butter, of course." She wrinkled her nose. "Figures." My son said nothing. And then in the middle of dinner, she turned to him and asked, "Do we really have to stay long?" She didn't whisper. I pretended not to hear. I reached for the rolls. My hand shook a little. I hadn't been drinking. I hadn't slept poorly. It was just the sound of my own irrelevance. My presence at this table used to command something, not fear, not power, just place. Now I was a set piece, a centerpiece. She talked more than he did, about their holiday plans, about how she wished they'd gone skiing instead, about how hard it was to find time for themselves these days. I nodded where I was supposed to, smiled when required, all while something inside me began to fold in on itself like a paper ornament packed too tightly away. I caught my son looking at me once, just once. His eyes held something not guilt, not warmth, more like discomfort. Like I was the part of his life he didn't know how to discard without looking cruel. So instead he reduced me, piece by piece, visit by visit. She asked if I had any sparkling water. I told her no, but I had cider tea or ginger ale. She frowned. Just water then. I got up again. I got up so many times that evening I don't think I sat for more than 5 minutes straight. I used to love serving people, but it only feels good when the people being served see you. At one point, as I brought out the pie, I glanced over and saw her tapping her nails against her phone, scrolling through pictures, probably their last vacation, somewhere warm, somewhere I'd never be invited. My hands were tired, my heart more so. And still I cut the slices. Still I offered seconds. Still I smiled and asked about their plans. And when they stood to leave barely 20 minutes after dessert, claiming an early morning, I helped them with their coats. She didn't thank me. He hugged me lightly like I might bruise. And then she said at the door, "Next year maybe we can just do a brunch out somewhere." I nodded. But in my mind, I quietly closed a door I hadn't realized I was still holding open. They didn't just come into my home and sit at the head of my table. They came into my life and rearranged it until I didn't recognize the shape of it anymore. After they left, I sat in the armchair by the window, the one with the old floral print, and the cushion that sinks just right when you settle in slowly. I sipped lukewarm tea and stared at the driveway where their car had been moments ago. The tire tracks in the snow were already beginning to vanish, covered over by a fresh dusting. That felt appropriate. Their visit had left almost no trace at all, just some crumbs on the table and an ache behind my eyes. I looked around the room. The lights on the tree still twinkled, and the candles I lit for ambiance now flickered as if unsure whether to continue burning. Everything looked beautiful, warm, thoughtful, but none of it had been seen. Not really. My efforts lived in a world they had long since left behind. The couch still held the imprint where my son had sat legs crossed, arm slung over the backrest, like he was visiting a waiting room instead of his childhood home. I could still smell her perfume in the air, cool, expensive, and just slightly out of place, like a stranger's coat left behind. I turned toward the corner of the room where my grandson's photo sat on a small table near the fireplace. He was 13 now, nearly a man. I hadn't seen him in person since his last birthday party, which I wasn't invited to. They said it was just for the kids, but I saw the pictures online later. Other grandparents were there. I hadn't been wanted. And still I bought him a gift this year, a winter coat, soft gray wool with a blue lining I thought he might like. I hadn't wrapped it yet. It sat in my closet tag, still on, waiting for a moment that would never come. When I asked why he hadn't come to dinner, she'd said he had other plans at 13. But I didn't press. I never pressed. I thought perhaps if I just stayed kind enough, gentle enough, he would remember me as warm, as safe. I thought maybe one day, when she wasn't pulling the strings, he might seek me out. But children grow in the direction of the hands that guide them, and those hands weren't mine anymore. It hit me then, in a slow wave, that I was no longer the center of any circle. I had become a quiet orbit around people who barely noticed. I was still spinning. My son, my grandson. Neither of them had truly looked at me all evening. There were times during dinner when I felt like a painting hung on a wall they'd walked past too many times to appreciate. I tried to remember the last real conversation I'd had with my son. Not surface talk, not the kind you offer to store clerks or polite neighbors, but something honest, something full of feeling. It had been years, maybe after his father's funeral, maybe before. I couldn't remember. That hurt more than anything. I had spent decades trying to raise a man with a kind heart, with gentle hands, with a sense of duty and love, and yet now here he was, speaking to me like someone he owed a visit, not someone he came home to. There had been no laughter, no shared jokes, just long silences, interrupted by polite commentary on the weather or their weekend plans. And when I looked across the table and saw him checking his phone while I spoke, I realized he wasn't just distracted. He was uninterested. There's a difference, you know. Distraction comes with guilt. Uninterest comes with detachment. And he wasn't guilty. He wasn't torn. He was simply elsewhere. As if my words were static and the only clear signal was coming from someone or something beyond me. I remembered holding him as a baby the way he'd curl into me, like I was the whole world. His first steps were taken right in this dining room, legs wobbly, arms reaching for my embrace. He used to bring me dandelions sticky with sap clenched in his fists like treasures. He'd sing silly songs and beg for one more story before bed. Now he barely said my name. I think I could have forgiven his distance, but it was the indifference that undid me. The way he let her speak for him, the way he let her decide where they sat, how long they stayed, what they said. The way he never once asked me how I was. Not truly, not with his eyes. It made me think about time differently. I used to see it as a bridge, something connecting me to him across seasons, across years. But now time felt like a wedge. The more it passed, the further apart we drifted, and I was no longer strong enough to close the gap. I had become a woman caught between two generations, a mother still waiting for her child to come home, a grandmother slowly being erased from memory, and all I could do was light another candle, pour another cup of tea, and pretend the hollowness didn't echo. But it did, loudly. After they left, I cleared the plates in silence. No offer to help with dishes. Of course, not that I expected one. But the sound of their laughter echoing down the hallway as they left together. Coats, bundled keys jangling felt colder than the wind that rushed in when I held the door open. I stood there for a moment longer after it closed, letting the silence fall heavy like snow against the windows. I didn't cry. Not then. I just looked around the room and felt misplaced, like I had hosted a dinner for people who never saw me. That was when I remembered the gift. It sat under the tree, wrapped carefully in gold paper, with a ribbon I had ironed by hand. I had tucked a note inside, just a small card with my handwriting curved and shaky now, but still full of tenderness. For all the winters we weathered together, it said, and I meant it. It wasn't grand, it wasn't expensive, but it was personal. A leather-bound journal. I remembered him saying back in April that he wanted to start writing more, something creative, something for himself. I'd listened. I had written it down in the margin of my calendar. Fine journal for him, brown leather, simple. I'd spent weeks looking for the right one. I even had his initials embossed in gold foil in the corner. And they gave me a candle. It was sitting in a gift bag near my chair at the table, one of those generic, mass-produced scented candles you find in clearance bins. It smelled like fake vanilla and cheap sugar, still had the price sticker underneath, half peeled. $11.99. I ran my fingers over the wax and felt something inside me falter. I know it's not about the money, it never has been, but gifts are language. They say, I see you. I remember what you love. You matter to me. That candle, it said none of that. It said, we didn't think. It said, this was convenient. It said, you're just a checkbox on a list. They didn't even look as I opened it. Didn't ask if I liked it. She was already checking her phone again, and he was nodding along to something she was saying. The candle wasn't for me. It was for the version of me they couldn't be bothered to know. I didn't open the journal for him. I didn't hand it over. I left it under the tree, the bow still tight. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to believe there would be a better moment. Or maybe, if I'm being honest, I couldn't bear the thought of seeing his face wrinkle with confusion, or worse, indifference, when I handed him something chosen with care. Because he wouldn't remember. He wouldn't know why it mattered. That was the moment the break inside me began to spread. A fine hairline crack that had started years ago now reached through the center of my chest. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like the sigh of an old floorboard under a weight it can no longer hold. I think that's the thing about these betrayals. They don't come like lightning. They come like frost, slow, creeping. You don't notice until everything's numb. After the dishes were done and the leftovers packed, I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my red cardigan. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked festive, wrinkled, tired, alone. That candle sat on my nightstand for 3 days. I couldn't bring myself to light it. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. It was like a monument to everything that had gone wrong between us, a waxen symbol of the distance that now stretched too wide to cross. On the 3rd day, I took it outside and placed it in the donation bin. Maybe someone else could find warmth in it. I couldn't. I went back inside and sat by the window, the Christmas lights still blinking soft colors across the living room. I thought about the time I stayed up all night sewing a costume for his school play, about the time he scraped his knee on the driveway and cried until I carried him inside, about the time he left for college and called me every night for a week because he couldn't sleep. Now he can't even remember what I like, what I care about, who I am beneath the title of mom. That journal. It's still here. I moved it from beneath the tree and placed it on the bookshelf in my room. I may give it to someone else one day, someone who listens, someone who looks. Or maybe I'll write in it myself. Maybe I'll fill it with every story he's forgotten, every version of me he no longer sees. They thought I couldn't hear them. The walls in this house aren't as thick as they look. My husband used to joke that secrets had no place here, the plaster itself had ears. But people forget that when they're careless, when they no longer see you as someone worth protecting, when they assume you've faded far enough into the background that your hearing must have faded too. I had stepped into the laundry room to fetch a fresh dish towel after dessert. I wasn't gone long, just a minute, maybe less. And in that minute, their voices floated down the hallway, soft but sharp, as they lingered in the kitchen standing near the sink I had scrubbed with lemon and baking soda that morning, hoping to make everything shine. She just talks and talks. Her voice scoffed low and laughing. God, it's exhausting. Like we get it. She made dinner. Can we go now? I froze. A silence followed, and for a breath I allowed myself the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, he would defend me. That he would say, come on, she worked hard, or it's just once a year, something, anything. But he laughed. Not a big laugh, not mean, but worse casual, comfortable, a laugh that said he agreed. Yeah, he said, at least it's almost over. I stood in that laundry room, gripping the towel like it might keep me standing, the hum of the washer. I hadn't turned on the smell of detergent, the faint draft from the window, all of it blurred into one sharp sound in my ears, the sentence that confirmed what I had been trying so hard not to know. At least it's almost over. I used to be the destination, the reason for the gathering, the warmth at the center of the season, and now I was something to be endured, like a cold meeting or a bad layover. I leaned against the wall and my legs felt hollow. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted me to my face. But somehow that made it worse. It meant his feelings were settled, solid, no longer something that might be soothed or reasoned with. I returned to the dining room and pretended I hadn't heard. I offered coffee. They declined. I cleared the dessert plates. She checked her makeup in the hallway mirror. He looked at his phone again. My mouth formed a smile, but my jaw felt heavy like a rusted hinge. I've weathered worse. I've buried friends, stood beside my husband through cancer stretched thin, our grocery budget during lean years, and kept my head high through every hard December. But nothing prepares you for hearing your child's voice float through a doorway and realize it's no longer meant for you, not even his kindness. After they left, I stood in the kitchen alone. I rinsed the pie plates. I wiped the counters. I reached into the drawer for the towel I'd meant to grab earlier and found it still neatly folded, untouched. And something inside me just sat down. Not physically. Not yet. But emotionally, spiritually, I lowered myself into a quiet space where the truth could finally breathe. I was no longer part of their story. I might appear in a few pictures. I might be included in the obligatory phone calls. I might even get an invitation next year. But my son had been gone a long time before his body stopped visiting. I just hadn't wanted to see it. The hardest part isn't being unwanted. It's realizing how long you've been unwanted and still showed up anyway. Still cooked, still called, still smiled. I had kept lighting candles in a room that no one ever entered. That night, after the kitchen was clean, I sat on the floor beside the oven and let the warmth from it settle into my back. I didn't cry right away. I just breathed, long, slow breaths, the kind they teach you to take when panic starts knocking at the door of your rib cage. Then I whispered, "Okay." Just that. Because something inside me had cracked open, not shattered, cracked gently the way earth does before spring. And from that crack came clarity, not rage, not revenge, but a shift, a slow awakening. I had been waiting for them to return to me, but what if I stopped waiting? What if I started tending to myself the way I'd always tended to them? What if I stopped trying to earn love from people who measured me in effort, but offered none in return? I didn't have the answers then, not all of them, but I had that first whisper of freedom. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The morning after Christmas, the house was too quiet. Not peacefully quiet, the kind of stillness that wraps around you when you're alone and deeply aware of it. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood by the tree still lit, blinking in soft colors. The presents beneath it were untouched. I had set aside small things for everyone, chocolates for her, socks for him, a book for my grandson, but they never asked, and I never offered. I didn't have the strength to play the role anymore. I turned on the old record player in the corner, Bing Crosby. The crackle of the vinyl filled the room before the music did, and for a moment, I was somewhere else, sometime else. Christmases used to mean something here. The living room would be strewn with wrapping paper. By now, smells from the kitchen curling through every hallway, voices rising and falling like song. My son used to burst out of his room in footed pajamas, cheeks still flushed from sleep, eyes wide with wonder. Did Santa come, he'd ask, even when he was old enough to know better? and my husband would play along pulling candy canes from the tree and winking like a magician. Now the tree stood straight and beautiful, but still, no one had admired it. No one had even mentioned the hand-stitched ornaments I'd taken down from the attic ones, made from felt and patience decades ago, their edges soft from time. I had sewn his name into one when he was 5. It hung near the top, tilted slightly, as if leaning toward me. I reached up and touched it. There's a weight that comes with being the keeper of memory, a burden to carry the traditions when no one else remembers the recipe for the stuffing or the reason the lights blink a certain way. I realized standing there that I was the last one who cared about those things, the rituals, the care, the why. They just saw routine, obligation. I saw legacy. Every year I'd laid out the same red and green quilt across the couch, the one we used to cuddle under to watch the Christmas specials. Charlie Brown, the Grinch, Frosty, the Snowman. I remembered how he used to fall asleep against my side finger, sticky with marshmallow from hot cocoa. He hadn't even glanced at the quilt this year. And I had made cocoa, too, left the pot simmering gently on the stove just in case someone asked, just in case he remembered. He didn't. There's a strange kind of grief in watching your traditions become invisible, not broken, not shattered, not even rejected, just quietly passed over like an old song they've heard too many times to still sing along. It isn't about the cocoa, or the ornaments, or the quilt. It's about what they meant, what they still mean to me. Because for me, those things weren't filler. They were threads, woven carefully across time, tying us together. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped holding his end of the string. I sat down on the couch, pulled the quilt over my knees, and tried to picture next year. Would they come again? Would I do it all again? Would I pretend once more that just their presence, brief and distracted, was enough? I didn't think I could. I stared at the tree until the lights blurred. Then I got up and unplugged it. The room dimmed instantly, and I felt it deep in my chest, that ache of finality, like I had closed a door that had been left ajar for too many years. That evening I pulled out the old photo albums, not to reminisce, not exactly, but to remind myself of what had been, to confirm I hadn't imagined it, the smiles, the closeness, the love. I traced my finger across a picture of my son on his first Christmas, propped up with a reindeer toy, almost as big as he was. My husband had taken the photo. I could almost hear him now, hold still, look this way as he clicked the camera with one eye closed and one heart wide open. And yet I knew better than to live there, in the past. Memories can keep you warm, but they can also keep you stuck. I needed to know what to do with all of this. This love I still carried. This ache. This hollow space where connection used to be. And that's when the thought came to me, soft and simple. Maybe love isn't always about holding on. Maybe sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to let go. To stop dragging the traditions behind us, like a sled too heavy to pull. To lay them gently down and say, you no longer belong to them. You belong to me now. And maybe that was okay. It's a strange thing to feel your motherhood unwinding, not in a flash, not in a blowout argument, not in some cinematic moment of confrontation. No, it unravels slowly like thread, slipping through your fingers inch by inch, until one day you wake up and realize your hands are empty. And it happened to me that night. Not with shouting, not with blame, just silence. The kind that sinks deep into the chest and settles there. I found myself back at the sink washing the wine glasses, even though they hadn't been used. I'd set them out with hope, like maybe this year they'd ask for a toast or raise their glasses in some quiet moment of gratitude. But they sat untouched, gleaming under the kitchen light, like little glass ghosts. The towel in my hand was damp and limp. The steam from the hot water fogged the window, but it didn't warm me. My reflection in the glass looked tired, hollowed. I used to love the soft tiredness that came after holidays back when exhaustion meant laughter, and dishes piled high from people who'd had seconds and thirds. But this tiredness wasn't earned. It was something else, something lonelier. I think what hurt the most was realizing I'd done everything right. I had shown up, cooked the meal, lit the candles, smiled through the sharpness. I'd done everything I was taught a mother should do. But motherhood isn't a performance you can win just by trying harder. It's not a transaction where love in equals love out. It's a relationship, and relationships require someone else to meet you in the middle. And mine hadn't met me in years. I used to hold on to the hope that maybe my son was just going through something, that once the kids were older or work slowed down or he found more time, he'd return to me, that this distance wasn't permanent, just circumstantial. But the way he looked at me or didn't over dinner, the way he let her control every word and moment, told me this wasn't a phase. It was a choice. He'd chosen a life where I was background, furniture, a fixture in a holiday he no longer cherished. And the worst part, I had let it happen. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. I let his silences go unanswered, his missed birthdays unchallenged. I excused the years he didn't visit the rushed phone calls, the way he never returned my voicemails. I didn't want to rock the boat. I thought maybe if I just stayed soft, he'd come closer. But softness without boundaries isn't love, it's erosion. I had slowly disappeared while smiling through every inch of it. I leaned over the counter and let my arms rest on the cool granite. My back ached not just from age, but from carrying a weight I hadn't known how to put down. The weight of still trying to be his mother, even when he no longer wanted one. When my husband was alive, we shared the pain. We whispered our worries after visits passed, knowing glances when the grandkids didn't remember our names, clutched each other's hands when goodbyes felt too distant. Now there was no one to hold, no one to share the ache with. Just the sound of the dishwasher humming behind me, a soft mockery of companionship. I walked into the living room and sat by the cold fireplace. The embers from the earlier fire had long since faded. I didn't bother stoking them. I stared into the great hands folded in my lap and thought about all the ways a mother gives her time, her body, her future. I thought of every fever I sat through, every birthday I planned, every lunch I packed, every lie I told to make the world gentler for him. And I asked myself with a painful honesty I'd never dared before what was left for me. The answer came slowly. Me. I was what was left. This quiet, wrinkled, soft-spoken woman who had been everything for everyone and had almost nothing left for herself. I was still here, still standing, and for the first time in a long time I felt a flicker not of joy, but of truth, of ownership. I wasn't just losing something that night. I was finally seeing what had been lost long ago, and that seeing, though it hurt, was freeing. Because once something breaks in the light, you can finally decide whether to repair it or let it go. I walked to the bedroom, passing the family photos on the hallway wall. I used to glance at them with pride. Now I saw them for what they were, fragments of a story that had paused long ago, smiles frozen in time, evidence that love had once been loud here, even if it had grown silent since. I didn't cry, not that night. Tears come when there's hope for change. This wasn't a night for tears. It was a night for reckoning, a quiet collapse of an identity I had clung to for too long. And as I slipped into bed, I whispered one thing into the dark. I'm still here. I lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling as the shadows of the tree lights danced faintly along the walls. I didn't turn them off. I liked the way they flickered, soft and inconsistent, like breath, like something still alive even when the room had gone still. I pulled the quilt up to my chest, hands clasped beneath it, and finally allowed myself to ask the question that had been blooming quietly in the background for years. How did we get here? How did I go from being his safe place to being his seasonal stopover? From the center of his little world to someone he squeezes into his calendar like an inconvenience? When did the conversation shorten? When did the laughs disappear? Was there a moment, a sharp one? Or was it all just time grinding love down like waves against a rock? I tried to trace it back, to chart the geography of our unraveling. There were so many small moments that seemed insignificant on their own. A missed phone call, a birthday card signed without a message, a visit cut short for a meeting he forgot to mention. I had overlooked them all as mothers do. We excuse, we buffer, we soften. It's in our nature to fill the cracks, to patch and plaster with warmth and hope. But maybe I should have spoken. Maybe I should have said, "This hurt." Instead, I smiled. I swallowed. I told myself he was busy, that modern life was harder, that she, his wife, was just different from us, that I didn't need much, that I could manage. And I did. I managed for years. But managing isn't living. I remembered the first time he brought her home. She wore a black coat, sleek and expensive, and looked around the house like she'd wandered into a museum of someone else's memories. She said it was cozy, a word that sounds kind, but isn't always. That first Christmas she offered to bring dessert, then showed up with a box of macarons and a look that dared us to criticize. I was grateful even then, even when I didn't feel welcome in my own home. I wanted to believe it would get better, that if I just showed her love, she would see me as more than a formality. But I was never more than that, and slowly, year by year, she became the gatekeeper. Calls went through her, plans went through her, even questions about the children went through her. And my son, he let it happen. He let her trim the branches of our relationship until it was no longer recognizable. And maybe I let it happen too. There were signs. I just didn't want to see them, like when he stopped asking about me and only talked about work, or when the family group chat they started didn't include me. "Oh, we just keep it small," she said. I was his mother. How much smaller could family be? But the moment that stays with me, the one that finally brought the crack to the surface, was his last birthday. I had sent a gift, handmade a sweater in a deep moss green I knew he liked. I didn't get a thank you, just a text 3 days later. Thanks. That was all. I stared at those words and felt something hollow out inside me, not because of what he said, but because I knew he hadn't even opened it himself. She had. She had probably tossed it in the closet the way you do with things you don't value, and I sat there wondering if he even saw it, if he ever wondered who still remembered his favorite color. That night I sat up and looked around my room. There were reminders of him everywhere. Photos, trinkets, school drawings in old frames, little things I couldn't bear to put away, even as he had clearly packed me into the back room of his mind. And I realized I'd been preserving a version of him that no longer existed. The man who came to dinner this year was not the boy I raised. He was polite, controlled, distant. I don't know when the shift happened, when he stopped asking how I was and started just assuming I'd always be fine, when my stories became rambling and my house became quaint, when he started seeing me as a symbol instead of a person. I don't think he meant to hurt me, but neglect doesn't have to be loud to be cruel. It can whisper. It can drift in like fog until you can't see your own worth anymore. And as I lay there heart aching, I finally saw that my love had become a one-way street, not because he hated me, not because he was cruel, but because he had stopped seeing me as someone who needed love too. And I had taught him that was okay. I had taught him that I would love without limits, without questions, without expectations, that I would be there always, no matter how little I received in return. I had taught him that my love came with no boundaries, and now I was the one paying for that lesson. But something had shifted this time. The cold, the silence, the candle, the words in the kitchen, they all added up. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just done. And sometimes done is the most sacred kind of clarity there is. It's strange how quickly people forget the person you used to be. When my husband was alive, I was someone, not in a grand public sense, but in the quiet, everyday ways that matter most. I was a partner, a teammate, a woman with someone to sit beside someone who would finish my sentences and remember the same inside jokes that spanned 30 Christmases. With him gone, I became less visible, less real somehow. Like I had slipped into a softer light, the kind that only flickers in the background. The first few years after he passed, people called, they visited. My son checked in more. I think they were all afraid of how quickly grief might pull me under. But grief doesn't always drown you fast. It's a slow fade, a gentle wearing down, the kind that takes years to hollow you out. And over those years, the calls slowed. The visits stopped. My son's texts got shorter. The conversations became laced with rushed phrases like, "Sorry, just really busy, and let's catch up soon." But soon never came, and I learned not to press. No one likes a mother who clings. The truth is, I learned how to live quietly, not by choice, but by necessity. I started filling the silence with routines, mornings with tea and the paper, afternoons tending to the garden out back, evenings with a crossword and a chair that creaks in all the familiar places. I got used to eating dinner by myself. I made enough for one. I talked to myself more. I hummed old tunes just to fill the air. I watched the mail like it might carry something unexpected, some reminder that I still had a place in someone's thoughts. But the mail was mostly ads and the occasional sympathy card during holidays, even those stopped after a while. There's a loneliness that widows don't talk about, not the kind that cries out loud, but the kind that settles deep in your bones and begins to convince you that you are no longer necessary, that the world has moved on and left you to sort through the attic of your own life. I remember one Christmas Eve 3 years ago, I made dinner, just like always set the table for two. Just like always. I even poured a glass of his favorite wine across from me the way he used to swirl it slowly before taking a sip. I sat there and talked to the empty chair like he could hear me. And maybe he could. But I knew my son wouldn't call. He hadn't the year before, or the year before that. It's not that I expect the world to orbit me. I'm not that foolish. But there is something profoundly painful about being forgotten by the very people you built your life around. I raised him, fed him, sacrificed for him, sat beside his hospital bed when he had pneumonia at 7, stayed up nights worrying about money just to make sure he could go on that school trip. I taught him to tie his shoes, to write thank you notes, to apologize when he hurt someone. I taught him how to love. And now I'm a holiday stop, a polite obligation, a woman who wraps gifts he doesn't open and prepares meals he doesn't finish. What's worse is how quietly it all happened. No fights, no betrayals, just the slow evaporation of presence, the soft disappearance of affection, the way he began to call me Mom like a title instead of a name. Even my grief became something I had to process alone. I remember calling him once a few months after the funeral. I had heard a song on the radio that reminded me of his father, and had pulled over sobbing into the steering wheel. I called him just to hear his voice. He picked up, said, "Hey, I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" He didn't. I didn't call again for a long time after that. There's something undignified about begging to be remembered, and I swore I wouldn't do it. But over time, I found myself hoping for small things: an unexpected call, a visit for no reason, a question that showed he still knew me. That never came. And so I grew smaller, quieter. My world shrank to the square footage of this house, the garden, the porch swing, the grocery store clerk who always asks about my tomatoes, the neighbor who waves but never comes in. That's who I became, a woman waiting for something she could no longer name. I didn't expect to become invisible. I thought after all I'd given that I would still matter. But I see now that motherhood doesn't come with guarantees. It's a gift you give without knowing if it will be returned. And mine, it seems, had reached its limit. I don't blame him entirely. The world moves fast. People forget to look back. They think we're fine if we don't cry in front of them. They think survival means we're thriving, and I helped with that illusion. I smiled. I told him I was doing just fine. I said, "Don't worry about me," and he didn't. But now I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of shrinking myself to fit in the background of his life. And for the first time, I feel something rise up in me. Not anger, not vengeance, just resolve. A need to reclaim the parts of me I gave away too freely. Because I am still here, and I am not a guest in my own story. It was the day after New Year's when I finally made the call. The snow had melted slightly, slushing beneath my boots as I walked to the mailbox that morning. But the air still had a sharpness to it, like something unfinished. I stood on the porch holding a letter I'd written weeks before, but hadn't mailed. It was addressed to my lawyer. I'd sealed it, then tucked it away, as if waiting for permission from myself to send it. That morning I didn't hesitate. I went back inside, brewed a fresh cup of tea, and placed the call. His receptionist remembered me. Her voice was warm and polite, the kind people use with women they assume are fragile. She asked if I needed to discuss a property question, and I replied simply, "It's about the will." A pause. "Then, of course, we can schedule you for tomorrow morning." When I arrived, the office was just as I remembered it, quiet, the kind of quiet only found in places where people speak in low voices about big decisions. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. He greeted me with a kind smile. "Mrs. Harland," he said, standing as I entered. "You're looking well." I wasn't, but I nodded. We sat across from each other at the polished desk, and he asked what brought me in. I pulled a folded paper from my purse and laid it gently in front of him. My handwriting was careful, too careful. Every sentence had been rewritten, every word weighed. "I want to update the terms," I said. He looked over it slowly. He was a thoughtful man, the kind who doesn't rush silence. When he reached the part where my son's name had been removed from the list of beneficiaries, replaced by 2 local charities, and one neighbor who had brought me soup during a bad winter, he raised his eyes to mine. "You're certain?" he asked, not with judgment, just caution. "I'm tired," I said. "Tired of being kind to people who see me as furniture. Tired of pretending that a shared bloodline guarantees shared love." He leaned back in his chair, studying me in a way that made me feel visible for the first time in months. "I see women like you more often than you think," he said gently. "Mothers who give everything and are left with silence. You're not alone in this." His words almost unraveled me, not because I didn't know them, but because hearing them aloud gave me permission to believe what I had been feeling for years, that this wasn't just some personal failure. that love given doesn't always grow back the way we hope. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I signed the papers with a steady hand. He reviewed the new terms with me. The house would go to a community shelter for elderly women. The savings I'd kept untouched since my husband passed would be split among 3 causes close to my heart: a local food bank, a literacy fund, and the hospice center that had cared for him. I added a note written in my own hand to be included with the documents after I passed. Nothing spiteful, just the truth. I gave everything I had, love, time, patience. But I was not seen, so I choose now to leave something behind for those who still see people like me. He slid the folder toward me, quietly impressed. "It's dignified," he said, "and it's yours to choose." That word dignified wrapped itself around me like a warm coat. As I left his office, stepping out into the crisp January air, I felt something shift. Not joy, not triumph, but relief. Like a weight I had carried so long I forgot it was there had finally been lifted. I walked slower, but lighter. It wasn't about revenge. I didn't want to punish my son. This wasn't a power play or a cry for attention. I just couldn't give to someone who saw my love as an entitlement. I couldn't reward neglect anymore. I passed by a coffee shop on the way home and stopped in. I ordered a slice of lemon cake and a cup of black coffee. I sat by the window watching people rush past with their scarves and steaming cups. No one knew what I had just done. No one looked at me twice. But I sat there with a quiet steadiness in my chest. I had rewritten my story. Maybe not the whole thing, but the ending, yes. And for the first time in years, I felt like the author of my own life again. That evening, after I returned from the lawyer's office, I brewed a fresh pot of tea, Earl Grey, with a splash of milk, and carried it to the kitchen table. The sun was beginning to set, casting a gold-tinted hush over the backyard, and the wind outside rustled the bare branches like a memory trying to get in. I sat there, fingers wrapped around the warm mug, and let the silence settle over me like a friend. It didn't feel so lonely anymore. It felt earned. I had spent years believing legacy meant blood. That inheritance had to follow bloodlines. That to love your child was to provide, to protect, to prepare something for them long after you were gone. And maybe that's true for some. But what do you do when that love is met with silence, when protection is dismissed, when the only thing your child has prepared is distance? I used to think it would be cruel to take him out of the will, that it would make me a bitter mother, that I would be judged by whatever relatives still paid enough attention to talk behind closed doors. But the truth is, it would have been more cruel to myself to continue giving to someone who had stopped seeing me as worthy. Because legacy isn't just about what you give, it's about who you give it to. And I wanted mine to go to someone or something that would remember me in ways my own son no longer could. The shelter down the street, the one where women sleep on cots beside windows lined with plastic tarps, had sent me a newsletter just weeks before. I had read it twice, underlined a sentence in black ink. Every woman deserves a place to be safe, remembered, and warm. I knew then that's where the house should go. A home for women forgotten by their families. Women like me. My neighbor, Sweet Helen, had brought me warm soup on Christmas Eve without asking why I was alone. She just knew. She's not family, not by blood, but she looks me in the eye. She brings her grandson by sometimes just to wave through the window. He always smiles. I added her name to the document too. Not the whole of anything, just a piece. Enough to know that someone kind would be touched by what I left behind. I opened the cedar box that night, the one I hadn't touched since my husband passed. Inside were all the things we'd tucked away. Over the years, the deed to the house letters we wrote, but never sent pictures from vacations we never labeled. I lifted each item gently as if memory had weight. And maybe it does. It certainly feels heavier when no one else is left to carry it. I found a photo of the three of us, my husband, my son, and me, on our front porch, summer of '92. We were barefoot laughing, holding melted popsicles. My son's face was round, full of mischief, and his arms were wrapped around both of us. I traced his little hand in the picture, and something in me ached for that version of him. That boy. But that boy was gone. He'd grown up into someone I no longer recognized. Someone who sat in my home with his coat still on. Someone who didn't remember what kindness looked like. And I had to stop grieving the boy and start choosing the woman I still was. I sat down and began writing letters, small notes to be tucked in with the final documents. Not bitter notes, no venom, just truth offered with grace. I wrote to the shelter, "This home held love once. I hope it holds love again. Let its walls hear laughter. Let its rooms offer peace." To the Literacy Fund. I was a librarian once. Books saved me when people forgot me. Use this to help someone else feel seen. To Helen. You looked at me, that's all. And in doing so, you reminded me I still existed. Thank you. And to my son. I wrote nothing. Because there are silences more honest than any letter. And I had given him enough words over the years. Words he didn't return. Words he didn't see. I left behind something more powerful, my choice. Choosing where my legacy would go wasn't about erasing him. It was about reclaiming myself. It was about deciding after decades of living for others to give the last chapters of my story the dignity they deserved. I didn't want a grand gesture. I didn't want attention. I just wanted peace. And that night, as I folded the letters and slid them into envelopes, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, a soft, steady knowing in my bones. This wasn't revenge. It was remembrance of who I am, of who I still am. I didn't plan for him to find out so soon. I assumed it would come later, years down the road, in the slow quiet after I was gone, that he'd open a folder one day expecting gratitude and instead be met with absence, with silence, with a truth he never saw coming. But life has its own timing. It started with a phone call, mid-January. Cold day. I was sweeping the porch bundled in 2 sweaters when the phone rang inside. I nearly didn't answer, but something in me said, "This is the moment." So I let the broom fall against the rail and stepped back into the house, the smell of pine and cold clinging to me like a coat. His voice was clipped, tense. "Hi, Mom." Just that. No warmth, no pause, not even the obligatory, "How are you?" I knew immediately he'd heard. "I got a call," he said next, "from a lawyer." I stayed quiet, let the words find their own gravity. "Is it true," he asked, "that you changed the will?" I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said simply. There was a silence on the line that stretched so wide I could feel the space between us as a canyon. For strangers, he snapped, voice rising. "You gave everything to strangers." I felt the heat climb up my chest, not from anger, but from something older, sadness, exhaustion. The weight of being misunderstood. "They're not strangers," I said calmly. "They're people who showed me kindness, who saw me." And I didn't. He barked as if that one sentence could undo a decade of distance. "You didn't see me," I said, "not for a very long time." His breath caught like he was about to speak, but no words came. I imagined him standing in his kitchen phone pressed tight against his cheek, surrounded by things his wife picked out in a home I'd never been invited to. I imagined his face the flush of embarrassment, just beginning to color his skin. Not from guilt, from exposure. "You're punishing me," he said. "No," I whispered. "I'm freeing myself." He scoffed. Unbelievable. I wanted to say more. I wanted to explain that this wasn't about spite, that it had taken me years to make peace with the truth, that I had clung to our connection long after it stopped being real, but I knew he wasn't ready to hear it, and I had stopped begging to be understood. I gave you everything I had, I said. Time, love, forgiveness. I gave you my heart, even when you didn't call, even when you came into my home and sat at my table like a guest. He was silent again. You left me alone, son, I added, voice steady now, not just physically, emotionally, for years. And I kept pretending that was okay. But it's not. It never was. There was a long pause, then a whisper so faint I almost missed it. I didn't mean to. I closed my eyes. That was the closest thing to an apology I would get. And it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Maybe once. But not now. Not after all the birthdays, missed the dinners, endured, rather than shared the candle that still sat untouched in a donation box. I know I said, but you did. I didn't cry. My voice didn't waver. There was no drama, no explosion. Just the sound of a mother finally choosing to put herself at the center of her own life. I have to go, I told him gently. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't say he loved me. And that said more than anything else could. I set the phone down and stood still in the living room, letting the silence settle around me like a familiar shawl. Outside, the wind blew through the bare branches, and I watched as a single bird landed on the feeder I had filled the day before. Simple, small, alive. For years I had lived with the ache of being unseen, and now for the first time I stood in the fullness of my choice. I wasn't trying to make a point. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation. I had written him out of my future, not to hurt him, but to save myself. And the moment I heard the crack in his voice, the disbelief in his breath, I knew he finally understood. He hadn't lost my money. He had lost me. After that call, I waited without meaning to. I checked the mailbox each morning as if something might arrive, a letter, a card, even a note scribbled in haste. I left the phone on the counter instead of the cradle volume turned up, glancing at it more often than I care to admit. Part of me, despite everything, still held space for some gesture of understanding, some acknowledgement, but it never came. No call, no visit, just silence. But it wasn't the quiet of someone unsure. It was the cold silence of someone offended, of someone angry, not because he was hurt, but because the dynamic had shifted. I had stepped out of the place he'd left me in for years, and that silence, it was meant to punish, to remind me I had broken the unspoken rule mothers are supposed to give no matter what. Instead, a message came. Not from him. From her. A brittle, biting email with no greeting, no warmth, just line after line of rage dressed up in politeness that barely held. She wrote about how disappointed they were, about how I had humiliated the family. She used words like selfish, irrational, and ungrateful. Ungrateful, as if the mere act of being their mother had earned them the contents of my will, as if my home, my money, my memories were some kind of inheritance tax they were owed simply for existing. And that's when it became clear they hadn't just expected something from me. They'd felt entitled to it. She ended the note with, "We don't know who you are anymore." I read that line 3 times, not with sadness, not even with shock, just quiet clarity. Because the truth was, they never did. They knew the version of me that smiled through dismissals, who stayed quiet during holidays, when plans changed without notice, who made excuses for their absence, who swallowed disappointment like tea gone cold. But they didn't know the woman who still woke early to tend the roses her husband planted, who cried into her dishwater the first Christmas alone, who kept photo albums organized by year and still wrote birthday cards in cursive, who had learned over time that being overlooked was a slow kind of death. They didn't know me, and maybe I had made that possible. Maybe I had been too accommodating, too willing to play small to keep the peace, to not make waves. I had become so gentle in my giving that they forgot I had limits. But this silence, this refusal to ask why, to try to see, spoke volumes. I didn't reply to her message. There was nothing left to say. I could have defended myself, explained, offered her the context she never earned, but silence, I realized, could be its own kind of statement, a final firm one. Instead, I lit a candle, not the one they gave me I had donated that months ago. This one was lavender soft and warm, bought for no one but myself. I placed it on the table beside the journal I once meant to gift to him, still unused, still waiting. I'd considered giving it away too, but something in me held on to it. That night I opened it. Not for him. For me. I wrote one sentence on the first page, I was here. And then I wrote another, and I mattered. The pen felt heavy at first, unused for anything intimate in years, but soon the words flowed like water, breaking through ice. I wrote about that last Christmas. I wrote about the candle, the meal, the seat at the head of the table, the overheard conversation in the kitchen, and I wrote about the will, not just what I changed, but why. Because I needed someone to know, even if it was only the pages of a book. Because legacy, I'd come to believe, wasn't about wealth. It was about witnessing. And if my son couldn't bear witness to my life, then I would. As I wrote, the silence didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like distance, like the closing of a door I had stood in too long, hoping someone would step through. It felt like space open and unfamiliar, but full of possibility. And somewhere inside that quiet, I found the sound of my own breath. Steady, certain, alive. The next Christmas came quietly. No phone calls, no mailed invitations, no last-minute messages about changed plans or who was bringing what. The silence this time didn't ache. It settled gently around me like snowfall on a still morning. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it wasn't pain either. It was something in between, something I'd come to make space for. I didn't put up the big tree that year, just the small one, the one I used to keep in the library corner back when the house was full and needed more than one glow. I decorated it with simple things, a string of white lights, a few wooden ornaments, one ceramic angel. No garland, no glitter, just enough light to soften the shadows. I made stew instead of turkey, thick and warm with potatoes and carrots and rosemary, clipped from the garden. My husband would have approved. I served it in my favorite bowl, the chipped one with the painted blue rim. I set only one place at the table. For the first time in years, I didn't pretend anyone else might show up. I didn't put out extra glasses or rehearse how I'd react if someone knocked unexpectedly. There would be no knock. And that was okay. I lit a candle lavender again and tucked a napkin into my lap like a quiet ritual. I ate slowly. Not because there was nothing to rush toward, but because I finally understood that slowness could be sacred. That when you stop performing for others, even your own breath feels like a kind of prayer. Outside, the neighborhood shimmered with lights. I could see the outline of Helen's tree through her window across the street, soft and golden. I had dropped off a tin of cookies the day before. She left me a thank you note and a pair of wool socks tucked inside my mailbox with a sprig of pine. That's what kindness looks like. Thoughtful, simple, no performance required. After dinner, I carried my tea into the living room and settled into my armchair. I pulled the journal from the shelf and opened it to a fresh page. "This is the first Christmas I've spent truly alone," I wrote, "and it's the first one I haven't felt invisible." The words surprised me as they flowed. Not invisible, because for the first time in years, I was not bending myself to be seen. I wasn't dimming my grief or shrinking my needs. I wasn't serving, waiting, hoping. I was simply being, quietly, fully. I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel proud. I just felt present. And in that presence, I found something I'd long believed was lost myself. Not the mother version, not the wife version, just the woman who loved deeply, gave completely, and finally learned to give some of that love back to herself. Later, I placed a few small gifts under the tree, not for my son, not for anyone who'd forgotten me, just for the charities I'd chosen the women in the shelter, and for Helen, a new tea set, the kind with delicate porcelain flowers and gold rims, something beautiful for someone who had looked at me like I was still a person. That night before bed, I opened the windows just a little. The cold crept in and I let it. The house no longer needed to be warm for others. It only needed to be honest for me. I stood in the dark, staring out at the quiet street and whispered, "I'm still here. Not as a mother waiting to be needed. Not as a widow haunted by what was lost. But as a woman who had finally and quietly chosen herself. And that I realized was the greatest gift of all,